In 2002, Bethesda released The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, and 3 years later, they released one of my favorite games of all time, The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, and in 2011, we got The Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim. 3 fantastic games, but what exactly has changed over the years when it comes to attention to detail? So I thought it'd be fun to start with how each game actually opens, because as you know, every Elder Scrolls game you start as a prisoner, and in Morrowind that's no different. You start as a prisoner coming from Cyrodiil in a ship over to Morrowind, and one thing I immediately noticed is that the walking animations of the people in Morrowind, everyone kind of looks like they just kind of shit their pants. But that's okay, once they kick you off the ship you do some paperwork, and that's when the fun begins.
You finally arrived.
Whereas in Oblivion, you start out in your cell in the Imperial City, and by the way, it's 100% canon, in case you didn't know, that every character is actually playing with the chain physics when the Emperor shows up to escape through their cell, just so you know. But yeah, you escape through the sewers, and that's when the game kicks the training wheels off. Whereas in Skyrim, you wake up bound in the back of an Imperial carriage on the way to the chopping block when a dragon shows up, starts killing everybody, and you escape in the chaos. But moving on, and one of the first things you'll notice when playing Morrowind is just how short the render distance is, as it seems like every step is illuminating the world from a thick white fog. Whereas in Oblivion, Elder Scrolls players are treated to the if you can see it, you can go there level of game design, which is a far cry from the thick heavy fog that hid the render distance in Morrowind. Whereas in Skyrim, they took this even a step further, as the level of detail in objects in the far distance are far greater than what we could see in Oblivion. And I know I touched on this at the beginning of the video, but it's worth mentioning that the walking and running animations are wildly different in quality between the 3 games, whereas in Morrowind, they just look outright goofy. Not to mention the really jerky animations when changing directions that you see in Morrowind. Not saying that Oblivions are fantastic by any means, but they're much more smooth and natural looking than what we saw in Morrowind. And Skyrim, of course, takes this a step further with much more natural looking walking and running animations, and changing directions is much more smooth than what we saw in the previous 2 games. Moving on now to a comparison of how interacting with NPCs work, and as you can see here in Morrowind, whenever you go to actually speak to an NPC, it brings up a text menu where you have to read all of the dialogue that the NPC is saying to you. Whereas in Oblivion, whenever you go to speak to an NPC, the camera crash zooms in onto the NPC and freezes the world around you, and the NPCs themselves are fully voiced, which is in my opinion one of the biggest improvements over the previous game. Whereas in Skyrim, chatting with NPCs has been completely overhauled, as you're no longer locked into the conversation you're having, and the world around you does not freeze when you're having the conversation, making the world feel much more alive when compared to the previous games.
I can forge it.
Moving on now to a comparison of the game's combat, and as I mentioned before, Morrowind's player movement being clunky and jerky also infects the game's combat as well, leaving it feeling a bit stiff when compared to the combat of the next 2 games, but when you look at the scope of what the game was trying to achieve, it's pretty impressive for a game that came out in 2002. Whereas in Oblivion, the moment-to-moment combat feels more smooth, as the player movement in Oblivion is more smooth than what we saw in Morrowind. Not to mention the added details like blood on your weapons and blood being splattered into the environment around you. Where Skyrim overhauls this as well, where you not only have the new shout abilities, but you also get to choose what's in each of your hands. Do you want to have a different weapon in each hand, a different spell in each hand, or anything in between? And not to mention the cool little slow-mo kill effects that serve as like little flourishes at the end of your combat encounters. They're pretty sweet. Moving on now to a comparison of the archery between the 3 games, and as you can see here in Morrowind, you actually hold your bow in your right hand, which is different from future games, and not only that, you can't see the arrows that you shoot into the environment. Whereas in Oblivion, as I mentioned, you actually shoot the bow with your left hand, and when you shoot arrows, you can actually see them and recover them from the environment. Whereas in Skyrim, you also shoot your bow with the left hand, but the slow motion kill effects also apply to the archery as well, which give you some of the most satisfying clips in the entire game. Moving on to the next detail that's always bothered me, in Morrowind, whenever you unequip a weapon, it just disappears off your character. You can't see it at all, and it just reappears in your hand whenever you equip it, which is an annoying detail that persists in newer Bethesda games. While in Oblivion, you can see the unequipped weapon on your character, which adds a nice bit of immersion. Though I do have to note in Oblivion, whenever this comes to unequipping a staff, you can also see that staff on your back. While in Skyrim, you can still see the unequipped weapons on your character, but when it comes to staves, as I mentioned, they simply disappear from your hands like they did in Morrowind. I don't understand it. Moving on now to a comparison of how magic works between the 3 games, and to keep it simple, we're just going to use a basic fire spell. In Morrowind, whenever you want to do magic, you have to enter a magic stance, which requires you to free up both of your hands in order to perform magic spells. Look at that cute 2002 fireball effect. While in Oblivion, you don't have to enter a magic stance, meaning you can still use your fire spell while having a weapon equipped. While Skyrim takes this all to the next level, allowing you to attack with a melee weapon and cast spells at the same time. Not to mention you can equip a different spell in each hand, which is pretty sick. And speaking of magic, the restoration spell saw quite a big cosmetic change between the 3 games. As you can see here in Morrowind, when I use this basic healing spell, it makes kind of a strange sci-fi sound, not to mention the cool little blue light that surrounds your character. Whereas in Oblivion, the only word I can really use to describe the sound of the restoration spells is refreshing. And the blue light returns from Morrowind, though this time it's spinning around your character and it illuminates the darkness around you, which is pretty cool. Whereas in Skyrim, the restoration spells have more of a sunlight vibe, and you can actually hear your heartbeat speeding up as it heals your character, which is pretty cool. And I thought it'd be fun to do a comparison between the 3 games. What happens to your character when you fall from a high height? So in Morrowind, I decided to use the flight scroll, and eventually I will hit the ground, I promise, and this is what happens. As you can see, Morrowind from 2002 doesn't have any ragdoll physics or anything like that, but Oblivion, on the other hand, most certainly does. As you can see when I jump off this mountain, I just kind of splat into the bottom and start sliding down. It can be pretty hilarious at times. Whereas Skyrim, on the other hand, does have ragdoll physics, but instead of hilariously splatting on the ground, he always does this stupid spinning dance move for some reason. I mean, he does this every single time. It's ridiculous. Also in this video, I wanted to show a comparison of a creature that is shared between all 3 games, and I decided to go with the mud crab. And as you can see here in Morrowind, this is a 2002 mud crab. I don't really know what to say. When it dies, it doesn't have ragdoll physics or anything like that. It kind of sounds like a sci-fi creature. Whereas in Oblivion, the mud crabs are much smaller and have a lot more color. Like, you see all kinds of red hues in there, and they look pretty cool. Not to mention, when you smack them, they have full ragdoll physics. I also noticed for the first time while recording this video that if you push a slaughterfish out of the water in Oblivion, it starts to flop around like a fish out of water, which is wild to me. I'm still finding new things in this game. Whereas in Skyrim, the mud crabs go back to being large rock-looking creatures, but have a ton more detail. As you can see the little mandibles and mouth flaps moving on the creature. It's pretty sweet. Then to my bewilderment, I found 2 more slaughterfish in Skyrim that came out of the water, though this time they don't flop around like fish out of water, so I decided to return them into the river. But totally unrelated, dead slaughterfish float on the surface of water in Skyrim. Which leads us to a comparison of the water physics between the 3 games, and as you can see here in Morrowind, these water physics from a game in 2002 look way better than they have any right to be. These ripple effects look fantastic when your character is interacting with the water, though I did notice whenever you jump into the water, there is a ripple effect, but there's no splash effect in Morrowind. Whereas in Oblivion, they look pretty much identical to what you saw in Morrowind, though they did add a splash effect whenever your character is actually jumping and entering the water. And Skyrim just has the mindset of if it's not broke, don't fix it, as it looks pretty much identical as it did in Oblivion and Morrowind, though the splash effect is much more pronounced in Skyrim. Moving on now to a comparison of the shadow effects between the 3 games, and as you can see here in Morrowind, this NPC shadow is a very hard, jagged shadow of the 3D model of the character, whereas in Oblivion, as you can see, the shadows are much softer as they actually are, and have this really cool long shadow effect, which looks pretty cool spread across the environment's geometry. While in Skyrim, the NPCs do have very detailed shadows, but they lose that long shadow effect that I was so impressed with in Oblivion. Which leads us to my final comparison in today's video, which is actually a comparison of how the 3 games handle waiting. And as you can see here in Morrowind, whenever you actually wait, it's pretty much instantaneous. The wait's over almost immediately, whereas in Oblivion, whenever you wait, it has to fade to a black screen and as you watch the hours tick by one at a time, and then the waiting is over. Whereas in Skyrim, they actually upgraded this significantly, where you can actually see the hours ticking by in real time, one at a time, so you can actually know when that pesky storm is going to be over, which is a very nice touch. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching this direct comparison of all of the 3D Elder Scrolls games from Morrowind to Oblivion to Skyrim. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you guys. And if you really enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like on it because it helps the video reach new fans. And as I always say, that's always a good thing. And I make new videos like the one you're watching right now every single week. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. But guys, as I said, that's all I have for this video. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.